The crowd didn't come to mourn. They came to watch. On a cold day in post-war Germany, thousands gathered in silence, waiting for a man named Curt Bruns to take his final steps. But what happened next would leave a permanent mark on history. This wasn't just an execution. It was a message, a warning, and for many, a moment of justice that felt long overdue. But here's the question that still divides historians today: was this justice, or something far darker hiding beneath the surface? Welcome back to X History, where we uncover the stories most people were never meant to fully understand. And today's story is not an easy one. Before we go deeper, if you're into real, raw history that doesn't hold back, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because stories like this, they don't just inform you, they stay with you. Now, let's begin. Curt Bruns wasn't born into evil. Like many men of his time, his early life didn't hint at the role he would eventually play in one of the darkest periods in human history. But something changed, and that change would put him on a path that led straight to a public execution. But who exactly was Curt Bruns? And why did so many people feel the need to watch him die? To understand that, we need to go back to Nazi Germany. During the rise of Adolf Hitler, Germany wasn't just transforming politically, it was transforming morally. Systems of power began rewarding loyalty over humanity, obedience over conscience. And for men like Curt Bruns, this system offered opportunity. Bruns became a prosecutor under the Nazi regime, a position that carried power, influence, and control over life and death. But here's where things take a turn. He didn't just follow orders, he embraced them as a legal official. Bruns played a direct role in prosecuting individuals who were considered enemies of the state. Many of these people weren't criminals in any real sense. They were civilians, resistance members, or simply individuals who didn't align with Nazi ideology. And the trials, they were often quick, controlled, and designed to end in one outcome: execution. Imagine standing in a courtroom where the verdict is already decided before you even speak. That was the reality for many under Bruns' authority, and it's exactly why his name became feared. But here's something that makes this even more chilling. To Bruns, this wasn't cruelty. It was duty. He believed he was serving his country, upholding law, protecting order. And that belief, whether genuine or not, allowed him to continue making decisions that cost countless lives. But history has a way of turning the tables. And when Nazi Germany fell, everything changed. Suddenly, the man who once held power in the courtroom was now standing inside one. After World War II ended, the Allies began hunting down individuals responsible for war crimes. Prosecutors, officers, officials, anyone who had played a role in the machinery of oppression. Curt Bruns was among them, captured and brought to trial. He faced the very system he once controlled. But this time, the outcome wasn't guaranteed in his favor. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Testimonies, records, witnesses who had survived his decisions. And for the first time, Curt Bruns had to answer for his actions. But here's where things get complicated. During his trial, Bruns claimed he was simply following orders, that he was a small part of a much larger system, that refusing would have meant consequences for himself. And this raises a difficult question, one that still sparks debate today. How much responsibility does a man carry when he operates inside a broken system? Is following orders ever a valid excuse? Or does the moment you choose obedience over humanity make you fully accountable? The court didn't hesitate long. Curt Bruns was found guilty, and the sentence, death. But what shocked people wasn't just the verdict. It was how the sentence would be carried out. Because this wasn't going to happen behind closed doors. This execution would be public. Thousands would be allowed to witness it, to see the man who once decided the fate of others face his own in that decision. It wasn't random. It was intentional. A statement to the world that justice had returned. that those who abused power would not disappear quietly into history. But as the date approached, tension began to build. People traveled from different places just to be there. Some came seeking closure, others curiosity, and a few something they couldn't quite explain. And Curt Bruns, he knew exactly what was coming. But how does a man prepare for something like that? What goes through your mind when the same system you once used is now being used against you? That day was getting closer. The crowd was getting bigger, and history was about to witness something it would never forget. But what actually happened during that execution? And why did it leave people disturbed rather than satisfied? That's where the story takes a turn you might not expect. The morning of the execution didn't feel ordinary. There was a strange weight in the air, like history itself was holding its breath, waiting to see how this moment would unfold. People began gathering early, not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands. Men, women, and families stood shoulder to shoulder, creating a silent sea of faces. Some looked serious, some curious, and some disturbingly calm. But one question lingered in the atmosphere. What does justice actually look like when it becomes public? This wasn't just about Curt Bruns anymore. It had become something bigger, something symbolic. Authorities had made it clear this execution was meant to be seen. A reminder, a warning, a message to anyone who thought power could exist without consequences. But as the crowd grew larger, so did the tension, because deep down, many people weren't sure what they were about to witness. Was this closure, or something unsettling then? The moment arrived. Curt Bruns was brought forward. No courtroom, no speeches, no dramatic declarations, just a man walking toward the end of his life. And here's what struck many witnesses the most. He didn't resist. He walked quietly, almost. Normally, that calmness made the situation even heavier. Because when someone who once controlled life and death shows no visible panic, it forces you to think differently about them. Was it acceptance, shock, or something else entirely? As he stood in front of the crowd, there were no grand final words recorded, no emotional breakdown that people might have expected, just silence. And sometimes, silence says more than anything else. The officials carried out their roles with precision. Every step followed protocol, every movement controlled. This wasn't chaos. It was structured, deliberate, and yet, the emotional atmosphere was anything but controlled. Some in the crowd felt a sense of justice finally being served. Others felt uncomfortable because witnessing something like this in person is very different from imagining it. It's real, it's immediate, and it stays with you. But here's where things become even more complicated. Not everyone reacted the same way. Some people watched without expression, as if they were trying to process what this moment meant. Others turned away, unable to continue watching, and a few stayed focused the entire time. That contrast revealed something important, not just about the event, but about human nature itself. How do people respond when justice becomes something you can see with your own eyes? Does it bring closure or create new questions? For many, the answer wasn't simple, because while Curt Bruns had been found guilty, the act of watching a life end in public didn't feel as satisfying as they expected. In fact, for some, it felt deeply unsettling, almost as if the line between justice and spectacle had started to blur. And that raises a powerful question. When punishment becomes public, does it still remain justice, or does it risk becoming something else entirely? Historians still debate this moment. Some argue that public executions like this were necessary at the time. After everything the world had just witnessed during the war, people needed to see accountability. They needed proof that those responsible were being punished. But others disagree. They believe that turning justice into a public event risks feeding something darker: curiosity, desensitization. even a sense of normalized violence. And when you look at the reactions of the crowd that day, you can see both sides. There were no celebrations, no cheering, just a heavy silence that followed, as if everyone realized, at the same time, that what they had just witnessed wasn't simple. It wasn't just good versus evil. It was something far more complex. Curt Bruns was gone, but the questions he left behind, they stayed. And perhaps that's the most powerful part of this story, because even today, we still struggle with the same dilemma. How should justice be carried out when the crimes are beyond ordinary understanding? Should it be private, controlled, or seen, so the world never forgets? That day didn't just end a life. It forced an entire generation to confront the reality of justice in its most visible form. But here's something most people don't talk about. What happened after the execution may be even more important than the execution itself, because the impact didn't end when the crowd went home. In fact, that's where the real story begins. When the crowd finally began to leave, no one spoke loudly. There were no heated arguments, no dramatic reactions, just quiet footsteps and heavy thoughts, because what they had just witnessed didn't feel like a clean ending. It felt unresolved, like something deeper had been exposed, but not fully understood. And that's where the story of Curt Bruns truly continues. Not in his life, but in the aftermath of his death. In the days that followed, discussions began spreading across Germany. Not about whether he was guilty, that part was clear, but about how justice had been carried out. Some people defended the public execution. They argued that after years of hidden crimes, secret arrests, and controlled trials under the Nazi regime, transparency was necessary. The people deserved to see that justice was real. Now it was, in their eyes, a restoration of balance. But others weren't convinced, because witnessing something so final, so irreversible, left a different kind of mark. They questioned whether turning punishment into a public event had crossed a line, whether, in trying to prove that the system had changed, it had unintentionally mirrored the very harshness it was trying to move away from. And that tension, it didn't fade quickly. Historians today still point to cases like Curt Bruns when discussing how societies rebuild after extreme injustice, because here's the reality ending. A regime is one thing. Rebuilding a moral system is something else entirely. After World War II, Germany faced a challenge unlike any other. It wasn't just about punishing individuals. It was about redefining values, rebuilding trust, and deciding what justice should look like in a new era. And moments like this became part of that process. Over time, public executions began to disappear, not just in Germany, but across much of the world, because societies started to recognize something important. Justice doesn't always need an audience to be real. In fact, sometimes, removing the spectacle makes it stronger. But that realization didn't come instantly. It came through moments like this. Moments that force people to reflect, question, and sometimes feel uncomfortable. And maybe that discomfort was necessary, because without it, there's a risk of repeating the same patterns under a different name. Curt Bruns' story is not just about one man. It's about systems, choices, and the thin line between duty and responsibility. Because at the center of it all is a question that still matters today. When does following orders stop being an excuse and start becoming a crime? That question doesn't belong to history alone. It belongs to every system where authority exists. Every moment where someone has to choose between what they're told to do and what they know is right. And that's why this story still matters. Not because of how it ended, but because of what it forces us to think about. The crowd that gathered that day expected to witness justice, and in many ways, they did. But they also witnessed something else: the complexity of human decisions, the weight of consequences, and the uncomfortable truth that justice is rarely as simple as it seems. As time passed, Curt Bruns became just another name in the long list of individuals connected to that era. But his case, his execution, and the public reaction to it remained a reference point, a reminder of a time when the world was trying to figure out how to move forward after experiencing the worst of humanity. And maybe that's the final takeaway. History doesn't just show us what happened, it shows us how people responded, how they adapted, how they learned, and sometimes how they struggled to find the right path. So when we look back at moments like this, it's not just about judgment, it's about understanding, because the more clearly we understand the past, the better prepared we are to shape the future. And that's what X History is all about. If you found this story valuable, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because there are many more stories like this that deserve to be understood, not just remembered. Until next time, stay curious.